Did anything crazy happen this weekend?
Well, for me, I got my nails done, so that was pretty
Wow.
crazy. But also, President Donald Trump got shot.
I will never forget, like, getting that text that it happened, and I go to Google it, and there's nothing. And I was like, what is happening right now?
Who
There was
texted you?
nothing. It was a friend who had a friend who was there. So it was, like, really
wow.
immediately. It was, like, within a few minutes I got the text, and I was, like, searching it. I was like, this is... No. Like, it would be on the news by now. And
fake
then all of a
news,
sudden
yeah.
it started rolling in. I was like, oh my goodness. And I thought that the photo of him with, like, the blood on his face was photoshopped at first, too.
Wait, that's so funny. Yeah, I have all my Twitter notifications on for all our lovely reporters who, God bless them, have no other life than just tweeting what's going on. I think it might have been Olivia Beavers. And I kind of saw the headline. I was like, oh, okay. Like, because it didn't say that he was shot. It just said there were, like, some loud bangs going on. And then I get a call from my fiance. He's like, are you watching the news right now? And I was down here in the basement doing my laundry. And then I go upstairs, and Anna Rose, my roommate, and her friend, they have the Fox News on, and it's, like, all the live footage. And I'm just like, what? It happened. Yeah.
So this was on CNN, but even they said take it with a grain of salt because they couldn't confirm this guy's story on their own. So it could turn out that this guy was, like, totally making stuff up.
Yeah.
But there was a rally goer who was talking about seeing the shooter climb up the roof, and that they were trying to alert Secret Service for minutes that he was up there. They were, like, pointing at him like, there's a guy up there with a gun. And he said that they were up there for, like, 2 or 3 minutes, which, if that's true, that's crazy.
Yeah. No, I think I saw that interview too. That was the guy with the with the visor with the fake hair on the top.
Yep. What a crew.
Listen, yeah.
I will say I was impressed with Biden's response.
Yeah.
I thought that was really strong. He did everything he needed to do. And you know, some people were criticizing him for not responding quickly enough, but I don't think that's true at all. He got on TV, made it very clear that he did not stand for this, and tried to call Trump. I don't know if they've spoken, but...
Yeah, I mean, same with Jeffries and, like, Schumer. The response has been, I think, very admirable, and can't shoot political opponents.
Exactly. Putting any personal feelings about Trump aside, his behavior during and after that was a media masterclass.
Oh my gosh. The AP photo of him with his fist up with the American flag in the background, that eats.
And
eats.
And he, like, when you watch the video, he had to, like, fight Secret Service for that photo. Like, he was like, I need my photo moment.
Wait.
Like I said, no matter how you feel about Trump, he is a master of the media. Mm-hmm. And he was sitting there, having just been shot in the ear, kind of probably a little disoriented, like, what is going on? And his first thought was, I need a good photo.
Yep.
And he was able to, like, rally the crowd up from that. And frankly, I don't think he loses after this. No. I can't see him losing.
And I'm headed to the RNC today, actually. So it's gonna be really fun to see how all that turns out. But I'm sure the security now is gonna be extra.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be insane. You're gonna have to tell us what your experience is like.
Yeah.
You know, obviously there are some people who were coming out like, oh, I wish that they had a better shooter, or I wish he hadn't missed, which is disgusting. But, like, frankly, there would be people saying that if it were Biden too. Like, oh yeah, there's just horrible people on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the day and age of social media, and you know, I think Twitter was trending with how do you miss that or something crazy like that. Which, like, you guys are all going on watch lists, by the way.
Yeah, that's not going to age well for them.
Yeah.
I also found it fascinating, the behavior of the crowd during it, because they didn't run and half of them didn't duck. I think, like, they were probably stunned a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then, like, with the proximity to Trump and the Secret Service around them, I don't know if they had, like, a false sense of security or if they just didn't know what was going on. Mm-hmm. But it was kind of fascinating to just, like, watch everyone kind of, like, duck. You would expect, like, a mass exodus out. So I guess it's possible that the entrances and exits were closed by Secret Service, but...
I think that's kind of what it was, too. And then, like, it looks like the National Guard almost, like, came in, too. Mm-hmm. A lot of, from the videos. Yeah, I saw one thing, too, that and this was a TikTok, so again, take it with a grain of salt. But someone was saying the area of Pennsylvania they were in too is pretty rural, and so they're like the people there might have also been like, there are people hunting all the time and stuff, and maybe gunshots to them aren't as startling as someone like me when I'm from the city as much. So if I'm there, I would I'm running, but.
I think
I don't know.
He has some sort of victory event it was Butler, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think so.
Butler, Butler. He's going to have some sort of event there. Like, I could totally see him having, like, if he wins, like, having his, like, big speech there. Like, he's going to have some sort of, like, quote, triumphant return
1,000%.
to that place. You just know it. And swing state.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so tired of living through history.
I know. You guys... behave yourselves. Stop it. Stop it.
Like, I was hardly fazed. Like, I was like, whoa, this happened.
I didn't believe it at first.
But then I moved on.
Yeah, right. Well, I think it was too weird. My roommates and I had the TV on. About 15 minutes, we were like, all right, well, I guess we'll go put in our movie that we were watching again. I don't think we're going to learn anything new right now.
Yeah. We've lived through so many things that it's like, things were almost calm for a while. It's like, oh yeah, there wasn't too much like world-altering, history-shaping events recently, so of course we were overdue for something like this.
Chaos every day. It's a really fun time to work in politics, isn't it? Don't you think?
Fun's one word for it.
Doesn't it keep you on your toes all the time?
It's a very active time to work in politics.
Not passive in the slightest.
Obviously, by the time this episode comes out, we'll know a lot more. But it was just crazy. What a time to have a crime podcast about politics.
Seriously.
We'll have to do an episode at some point talking about the assassination attempt once we have all of the information. Maybe that can be a little August recess project for us.
Yeah. All right.
Well, moving on.
My only other bit was, I think it started from a tweet, but I can't remember now. But there was something like, the shooter heard Katy Perry's Woman's World, and that was the final straw. I can't take it anymore. Something's got to change.
Oh, you know what? I read something this morning that said, so the shooter was a registered Republican.
But he
donated $15 to a Democrat campaign.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he was in high school.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, he's 20 years old. Yeah, the shooter is 20 years old, I believe. And he at least graduated high school in 2022. And yeah, I think he donated $15 to Act Blue when he was in high school, which, like, sure.
Yeah, but, like, which one do you take seriously? Do you take the registration? Because he could have registered in high school at 18, too.
Right.
And then I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of Republicans who despise Trump, and so he could have been one of those, like, never Trumper Republicans.
Yeah.
Obviously, he has some strong feelings about him.
Clearly.
Or he could have just been someone who was crazy and wanted attention.
Yeah.
And there wasn't as much of a political motive behind it as we think.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear about the motive. Yeah, those two very conflicting things. But again, yeah, he's young. He's young. Which is, yeah.
And the people who were saying, like, I heard some people who were criticizing the crowd for not shooting back. Because they were like, oh, you guys are, Trump supporters. You all have guns. But, like, you can't bring guns to a Trump rally.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
You're vetted by Secret Service.
Exactly.
You're, yeah.
It doesn't matter how pro-gun you are. The Secret Service is not going to let you in an audience with the president with a gun. Yeah,
and there are police snipers. Yeah, you're not going into a Trump rally with a gun. I'm sorry. This isn't like you're Joe Blow, running for city council, right? This is,
and
Donald Trump.
If they had started shooting back, they could have become targets from Secret Service.
Yeah.
They might not. So that's just such a silly argument. I feel like there are a lot of people who are really disappointed with or just really disappointed that this would happen to a Republican candidate, because I think that it does disrupt a little bit of this narrative about, like, Republicans are the ones with guns, Republicans are the ones who are violent and are willing to do these things to, make sure Trump's in office. And while there have definitely been some atrocious crimes that have happened with that goal, this I think a lot of people are just kind of shocked, like, oh, it can be us too. And like not realizing that there are crazy people everywhere.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that's a fact. There's one thing you can take away from this episode, crazy people are everywhere.
Crazy people are getting crazy.
All right, folks, we are back with part 3 of our series on the Watergate scandal. Today's episode is a deep dive in what I consider to be the bulk of Nixon and his staff's efforts to cover up the connection between the Watergate break-in and the Nixon administration re-election committee, known as CREEP. But once again, I'd like to thank author Garrett Graff for your lovely book, Watergate, A New History. Most everything I talk about in this episode is pulled from that book, and you should definitely read it because there are so many good tidbits in there that I just did not have space to put in this miniseries.
I haven't read it, but watching Sarah read it, she's so like, oh my gosh, there's so much I can't even say. So like there are a lot of tidbits. Go read the book.
Definitely. So this episode is going to cover items from June 18th, 1972, a day after the final break-in at the Watergate complex, all the way to April 30th, 1973. So in this time, Nixon and his staff make a bad situation 1 million times worse through their elaborate schemes to cover up the truth that the break-in was not just a one-off rogue operation. It was, in fact, just the most recent instance of clandestine and illegal operations orchestrated by the White House themselves. So, there's your teaser. Let's get into it.
She's Sarah.
She's Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. So the 5 men who broke into the Watergate complex were James McCord, Bernard Barker, Frank Sturgis, Virgilio Gonzalez, and Eugenio Martinez, and they were arrested. During all this, our White House plumbers, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, were scrambling to clear the hotel room they were using and to hightail it out of there. That night, Hunt called his lawyer friend Douglas Cowdy to represent the 5 men arrested, while Liddy went straight home and reportedly told his wife that he'd probably end up in jail.
Oh yeah, I remember that. And wasn't it also like weird for the police because the news hadn't broken that they were arrested, so like why is this lawyer showing up?
Yes, exactly. They're like, none of the guys had made any calls either, any of the arrested men. So how would they know? How would the lawyer know that he needed to go represent them?
Suspicious.
Many questions. That, again, is a shameless plug to go back and listen to part 1 and 2 if you haven't already, because they're very important contexts. So the next day after the fateful break-in, Liddy drove to the gas station and used a payphone to call his boss at CREEP, Jed Magruder. Unable to get in touch with him, Liddy drove over to his office at CREEP, where he began to destroy his files in a shredder. So that morning, Liddy even ran into CREEP treasurer Hugh Sloan and told him, this is a real quote, or at least that Liddy said, "Our boys got caught last night. It was my mistake. I used someone from here. Something I told them I'd never do. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to keep my job."
Good morning to you too.
Yeah.
What about hello?
Hugh Sloan is just pouring his coffee in a mug and like, what? What are you talking about?
The fact that he's just so willing to take the blame for this like really big crime too. Crazy.
I also like how he went from telling his wife, "I'm probably gonna go to jail," then the next morning be like, "I'm at least not gonna keep my job."
Yeah.
So later that morning, Liddy got word from the former AG and now head of CREEP, John Mitchell, that he was scheduled to have a press conference in California. So Liddy ran over to the White House to get a secure line to call Magruder again and fill him in on the night prior. When learning that Liddy had used James McCord for the break-in, remember, a former government employee with his fingerprints on file, Magruder said, "Why, Gordon? Why?"
It's the question we're all asking.
Mm-hmm. And then Magruder allegedly told Liddy to have the current Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, intervene. Magruder then went to tell John Mitchell, who reportedly said, "That's incredible." Unsure exactly what he meant by that, but just wanted to flag, I thought it was an interesting reaction. But as we'll see, the panic button is just like not really on for everyone at this point. However, some folks like Liddy and Magruder were alarmed immediately. Magruder even called one of his aides back in D.C. and told him to remove all the Operation Gemstone files from his office. But back in D.C., Liddy intercepted, or, I don't know, well, kind of stalked AG Kleindienst at the Burning Tree Golf Club, so Liddy was finally able to pull Kleindienst aside They had only met once before, and he started spilling the beans. He ended up saying that John Mitchell himself had asked Richard Kleindienst to get the 5 burglars out of jail at once. Kleindienst said, "John Mitchell knows how to reach me, and I don't believe he gave you any such instructions."
Fair.
Kleindienst, for his part, later that day called the head of the Justice Department's criminal division, Henry Peterson, and told him that the burglars should be treated like anyone else. Funny enough, though, Peterson apparently received a phone call from White House counsel John Ehrlichman that same afternoon, who asked him to wrap up the investigation ASAP, saying, "You have the burglars, close it down in the next 24 to 48 hours. To which Peterson said, "Screw you."
Snaps all around.
They started out strong, at least.
Wait, I don't like how you said that.
So that weekend, White House counsel John Dean had been in the Philippines, and when he landed in California on Sunday, he learned of the break-in from one of his legal aides and flew back to Washington immediately. Apparently, he didn't learn of McCord's involvement until he was back in D.C.
Who is John Dean again?
Good question. So we didn't really chat about him last episode, but you may remember John Dean from episode 1. Dean served as White House counsel for President Nixon. Notably, he was in the room at the same time as AG John Mitchell and Magruder during Liddy and Hunt's Operation Gemstone presentation. So while he wasn't aware of the day-to-day operations of Operation Gemstone, he had been clued in from the beginning about some of Hunt and Liddy's plans that were essentially okayed by Magruder and perhaps John Mitchell himself. John Dean is a super important character in this episode because, as you'll learn, he really ends up leading the cover-up. But first, some other notable reactions to the Watergate break-in. White House Chief of Staff Bob Hadelman thought the break-in was first part of a Chuck Colson scheme. Colson, if you remember, was Hunt's friend who brought in Hunt initially to the Nixon administration to fix leaks. But overall, Hadelman thought the whole thing was kind of funny. He couldn't fathom why anyone would want to bug the DNC headquarters. Hadelman passed on the news to Nixon himself, who was furious. Nixon even called Colson to ream him and told Colson that he threw an ashtray across the room in rage. However, Nixon, it seemed like, was in no rush to get back to D.C. and just went about the rest of his weekend in Florida.
Was that the extent of Nixon's reaction?
For now, yes, but it won't be long before Nixon himself gets involved in the cover-up.
Uh-oh.
So not even 24 hours after the break-in, things were starting to unravel, and fast. You see, investigators were quickly able to link the burglars to Howard Hunt, since his name was on some mail and in the address book found on the burglars. Upon being interviewed, Martinez also told the FBI that his team worked for the president, just like the FBI.
Yikes.
And during the preliminary hearing for the burglars, which also happened on Sunday, James McCord revealed that he had recently retired from the CIA. AP also reported that day that McCord was a security coordinator for the president's re-election campaign.
Double yikes.
In response, John Mitchell put out a statement that said, "The person involved is the proprietor of a private security agency who was employed by our committee months ago to assist with the installation of our security system. He has, as we understand it, a number of business clients and interests, and we have no knowledge of these relationships. We want to emphasize that this man and the other people involved were not operating either on our behalf or with our consent. There is no place in our campaign or in the electoral process for this type of activity, and we will not permit it or condone it." Obviously, this statement does not age well.
No, not at all. I can already tell.
So Monday morning, John Dean headed to work to assess the damage. He summoned Liddy, and the two men went for a walk. Interestingly, Dean remembered Liddy as looking rumpled and unshaven, while Liddy later reported that he made a special effort that morning to look put together, even wearing a fresh suit.
I've been in that position before where it's like, I feel like I look so good, and my husband's like, "Do you want to put on some concealer?"
Looking a little tired today.
Yeah. You went casual. I'm like, no, I was upstairs for 45 minutes.
Wait, I love this scenario because the way I saw it, I was like, oh, it's like a he said, she said thing. But I love this idea that Liddy thinks he looks so good.
He's like, I look fresh.
And he actually just looks terrible.
Oh man, now that's a print forever. That's just like insult to injury right there.
Once the two got to a park bench, Dean confirmed that he would be the contact for the situation moving forward. Liddy then filled Dean in on the scope of what he and Hunt had been up to. Liddy also confirmed that it was Magruder and not Colson who was the guy that knew about it / okayed the mission. Liddy was confident McCord and the rest of the arrested men wouldn't talk, but would expect some degree of support, aka bail money, money to take care of their families, money to pay attorneys. Allegedly, Dean agreed, although he denied it later. However, please note that hush money does flow towards the burglars. We'll get into that later. Liddy also told Dean that day, "Look, John, I said I was the captain of the ship when she hit the reef, and I'm prepared to go down with it. If someone wants to shoot me, just tell me what corner to stand on, and I'll be there, okay?"
What?
Yeah. Listen, Liddy is committed to this bet beyond anything else, to a fault.
He is the main character of this story just by his own sheer will and determination.
Exactly. So on the topic of Hunt, Dean also said that he thought Hunt should leave the country as soon as possible. Dean then ended the conversation saying, "Gordon, I don't think it's a good idea for me to be talking with you anymore."
So he flipped the script, right? He told Liddy he was the action officer and then said, "Never talk to me anymore."
Yeah, exactly. I kind of read one thing from Garrett Graff's book that the conversation is really interesting because basically Dean confirms that he is like this like contact moving forward, pumps Liddy for all the information, then kind of says, "Oh, don't talk to me anymore," because he realizes that no one like blames him or anyone from the White House per se. It's really just like Magruder and like John Mitchell, perhaps.
So it sounds like you kind of have a mix of like some people are doing things for the betterment of the group, some people are doing things for their own personal benefit, and it's not totally clear in the moment who's doing what for what purpose.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it seems like from the beginning, at least, that Dean was ready to cover up the scandal from the get-go. After that conversation, Liddy passed on the message to Hunt. At first, Hunt balked at the idea of leaving the country, saying it made him look like a fugitive.
It would make him a fugitive.
Right. But eventually, they agreed that Hunt would use the remaining $1,500 left in the Gemstone Fund to flee the country. Not even an hour later, Dean called Liddy and told him that White House aide and Nixon's number 2 man after his chief of staff, John Ehrlichman, said to cancel Hunt's move. But Hunt ended up leaving the state anyways for New York and then California, growing tired of the reporters that had been hounding his family and home. Back at the White House, John, Dean, and the inner circle were trying to figure out who knew what when. Despite Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, publicly dismissing a presidential link or interest in the Watergate break-in.
That also probably doesn't age very well.
You are so correct. After talking to Coulson, Dean and Ehrlichman decided that Dean would take custody of the safe that was inside of Hunt's office. Chief of Staff Hadelman formed a general plan to contain the break-in to creep into the lowest level players, as well as to limit the political ammunition for the Democrats with just over 100 and some days until the election. However, containing this to creep was going to be a pretty tough lift with Hunt and Liddy's previous connection to the White House through their plumber activities. What the Nixon team really needed was to shut down the actual investigation and keep the burglars from talking.
So obstruct justice.
Amazingly, that Monday night, Nixon seemed to recognize this immediately and told Hadelman, quote unquote, "These people who got caught are going to need some money, and I've been thinking about how to do it."
Boom! Enter the hush money.
That is not all. Nixon also wanted his team to play up this anti-Castro angle. This, he reasoned, would help them raise money from defense funds for the Cubans arrested and would incentivize the CIA to block the investigation from their side to hide their operations, aka failures or messy operations a la Bay of Pigs. To review, by Monday night after the break-in, Nixon was thinking the way out of the muck was hush money and using the CIA to interfere in an active investigation.
Covering up crimes with crimes. Cool.
Yep. And once again, I'd like to note that Nixon thought the bugging or attempting to bug the Democrats is really defensive measure. He told Coulson as much in the days after the break-in. So whatever rage Nixon showed over the whole situation, I think was about his people getting caught and implicating him. Also that Monday night after the break-in, John Mitchell allegedly suggested to Jeb Magruder that he have a fire at his house to destroy the Operation Gemstone files. Magruder did exactly that.
Was the shredder not enough?
No. On Tuesday, the effort to destroy any remaining paper trails continued. Hadelman told his aide to, quote-unquote, make sure our files are clean. Coulson, for his part, ran around trying to destroy any telephone directories that listed Hunt as working for him. Liddy even collected hotel soaps from the Fielding break-in and from their other earlier scouting operations and threw them in the Anacostia River.
The one time they decided to pay attention to detail.
Liddy also shredded the rest of the sequentially numbered $100 bills because, remember, 24 of those bills had been found on the burglars.
What a mess.
Later that week, Nixon said publicly, quote unquote, the White House has had no involvement whatever in this particular incident. Going back to this idea that the Nixon team needed to shut down the investigation itself starts with the White House's manipulation of the FBI and the CIA. To the FBI agents covering the case, John Dean insisted that he be present for any FBI interviews with the White House staff. Dean also began a dialogue with FBI Acting Director Patrick Gray. Dean tried telling Gray that tracing the cash they found on the burglars might upset the CIA. However, Gray came back and told him that he had already talked to CIA Director Richard Helms, who did not think that there was a connection between the CIA and the break-in. Gray also told Dean that until there was a clear CIA link, they would press forward with their investigation. To go around Helms, Hadelman told Nixon they could block the investigation if they got the CIA Deputy Director Vernon Walters to wave Pat Gray off instead. Word for word, Hadelman said, but the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and say, stay the hell out of this. There's some business here we don't want you going any further on. Nixon signaled his approval for this idea, saying, which again is crazy, and I would like to remind listeners at home that all of this is recorded because of the Oval Office recording system that they had going on.
He was so paranoid that people would turn on him or something that he was like, oh, I need transcripts of everything.
Mm-hmm.
But all he did was create transcripts of his own crimes.
Right, exactly. It is really nuts that we have a transcript and audio recording of the Nixon staff saying, hey, let's obstruct justice here.
I think I said this in part 1, but literally all they needed was a singular woman on the team.
Just one. Yeah.
One woman to be like, hey, maybe we don't record our crimes.
Hey, maybe we don't have this conversation here.
Hey, maybe if we need to shred everything, we just don't create a paper trail.
Yeah, period. Please destroy this, huh?
Insane.
In the next few days, Ehrlichman and Hadelman had a meeting with CIA's Richard Helms and Vernon Walters, where Hadelman asked point blank if Walters would call up Gray and suggest to him that the investigation into the break-ins should stop with the arrest of the 5 burglars and not go any further. Helms again balked at this, but Walters, just 6 weeks into the job, finally agreed and met with Gray. After this conversation, Gray agreed to drop the Mexico element of the FBI's probe.
Hold on, Mexico?
Yeah. I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but the point here right now is that Nixon and his team used their authority and this national security angle to get the CIA to call off the FBI's investigation in some capacity. A very not good thing. Walters, for his part, did ask around later to see if the CIA had some covert mission going on in Mexico. It did not, though. So Walters started making his own paper trail documenting his further conversations with the White House.
Even these lies are so sloppy.
Mm-hmm.
So sloppy.
Back to the FBI, John Dean also convinced Pat Gray to supply him with the raw interview reports from the ongoing investigation, a move that kept Dean and the White House one step ahead, and also a crazy thing for the FBI to do. This was an outrageously bad move from Gray, who had no idea that the AG himself had told Dean no to the same request, saying it was inappropriate for White House counsel to have access to the raw FBI interview reports.
Once again, yeah, I agree.
In addition, Dean also manipulated the evidence that was handed over to the FBI from Hunt's office safe. The more innocent contents of the safe were handed over to the general FBI agents assigned to the case, while Dean handed over more sensitive, but not damning, materials to Gray himself, saying that they were political dynamite and were not to be handed over to the investigating agents. Dean figured that if he was ever called to testify, that he could honestly say that he handed everything over to the FBI.
It seems like they are the ones raising the suspicion that this is a bigger thing that the White House was involved in because they're so involved in it.
Yeah.
I understand the urge to make sure that everyone's doing what they're supposed to do, make sure your files are shredded, this and that. But I feel like they're raising more suspicion because their actions are super suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think largely it could have been contained to creep if they hadn't gone above and beyond. However, as we'll see, there is some evidence that really does. It's really Hunt and Liddy and the plumber activity that gets us back to the White House. And so I see why they also would want to do everything in their power to make sure that didn't link back to them. I don't know.
I think they were just talking to too many people. Destroy your evidence first, see what the FBI and CIA know, and then start trying to cover things up. Don't start, like, floating all of these different, like, threats and lies to people when you don't even have a cohesive story yet.
Right. A woman would have stopped this.
Yes, a woman would have stopped it.
However, I'd like to flag that even though Dean said that, had this forethought that he could say that he gave everything over to the FBI, he didn't, because he actually placed the most incriminating evidence in his own safe. This really incriminating evidence was actually Hunt's 2 Hermes notebooks that thoroughly documented his time during the plumber operations and the Operation Gemstone work.
I love how you made the point that they were Hermes.
I mean, I had to. He's a bougie man. By the way, Gray, from the FBI, would end up burning the files later that year. And as he would testify later, he felt that destroying the files was an order from the Council of the President of the United States.
Buffoons.
Buffoon behavior. A week after the break-in, the FBI also established a connection between the burglars and Liddy himself, who was also listed in the address books recovered. So again, immediately the FBI is, links Hunt back. He's like, this guy's involved with it. And then it's pretty soon after that Liddy is also now. So it's already not contained to just the 5 men who were arrested. It's now connected to Liddy and Hunt.
I'm honestly disappointed in Liddy and Hunt for not coming up with code names. They just seem like code name kind of guys.
Well, which they are, because when Liddy called Hunt to tell him that Dean had told him that he needed to flee the country, he uses a code name. He uses a cover name.
But he doesn't think to put the cover name to tell the burglars, like, hey, put my cover name in your address book.
Right, exactly. They didn't even think that there was going to be a basic investigation into this. No.
They didn't even do the bare minimum to cover their tracks. They were like, as long as we can get in and out, we're good.
Right, exactly. And as long as we can, bribe a security guard, there's no way they'll call the police when we actually break into this place as well. Again, these men are in love with the idea of espionage, but they have no idea how to do it.
They're like cosplaying.
Yeah, exactly. So when the FBI tries to interview Liddy, he refused. And this causes Liddy to officially be fired from Creep. He wasn't fired yet. Because a command had come down sometime in that past week that employees were to fully cooperate with the FBI or risk termination. So Lydia now officially has the axe.
It was time.
Mm-hmm. Now, by the end of the month of June, Creep also lost another official figure with John Mitchell's resignation, which Nixon had urged. Nixon was under the impression that John Mitchell had okayed the burglary, which again is probably not the case.
Right, because I think in the last episode you talked about how it was likely Magruder who actually gave the final say.
Right, exactly. But we may never know for sure.
And Nixon knew.
Mm-hmm.
He knew enough to be guilty.
1,000%. Now, remember how I threw out the term hush money earlier? Well, it's time to talk a little bit about that. So after failing to get the CIA to post the burglars' bail and legal fees, which they also tried to do, crazy, John Dean goes to this man named Herbert Kalmbach, who was an attorney and fundraiser for Nixon. Over a conversation in Lafayette Park...
Not Lafayette Park!
Oh, you know the one. Anyways, so during their conversation, Dean got Kalmbach, I think it's Kalmbach, sorry guys. Dean got Kalmbach to agree to get together the necessary money. Kalmbach then enlisted the help of this man named Tony, we're just going to call him Tony, who was a one-time New York City police detective, to be the actual money runner, right? So after a meeting in a hotel, Tony walked away with $75,100 in cash from Nixon's campaign.
His campaign?
Yes.
They couldn't at least try to do an offshore account?
I can't get into it. I didn't get into it. But there's this whole thing where there is this whole slush fund of like untraceable money that essentially the Nixon campaign I kind of squared away before all the campaign finance rules got passed, like in April of that year. So yes, it's technically all campaign money for the record.
Okay, so they just kind of like were able to use a campaign finance loophole.
Yes, less of a loophole, more of they put all the money elsewhere before all the campaign finance laws came into place in April.
Got it.
There's a lot more to that. I'm not going to get into it. And sorry if I butchered it, listeners. So Tony called Hunt's attorney as a man named Mr. Rivers and asked to be connected with the writer's wife, an obvious nod to Hunt's wife, Dorothy, because remember, Hunt is a little novelist on the side. After checking with Creep, the attorney confirmed that Mr. Rivers was a campaign representative. Mr. Rivers/Tony then called Dorothy directly and told her to go to this phone booth on the Potomac Village within 30 minutes. At that phone booth, Mr. Rivers told Dorothy to contact the burglars' families and collect their living expenses. So then later, armed with that information, Mr. Rivers told Dorothy that they would multiply the monthly expenses by 5 to cut down on the trips. Dorothy immediately took notice of the number 5 because there were only 5 months until the election. Did that mean they were only going to be taken care of until the election?
Does it?
Who knows? We'll see.
Keeping us in suspense.
But anyways, following Mr. Rivers' directions, Dorothy went to the National Airport, found a locker key under a specific payphone, and then found the locker with a bag full of cash. The cash only covered 3, not 5 months of living expenses, but it was cash after all. Liddy also got a similar call and directions to collect his own cash. Overall, Tony/Mr. Rivers parceled out $26,000 to Liddy and $154,000 to Dorothy to distribute to the burglars' families.
That's a lot of cash.
Mm-hmm. And now that we're on the topic of campaign funds, investigators also established a connection between the burglars and Nixon's re-election campaign through the money they found on Bernard Barker. The sequential $100 bills were traced back to 2 bank withdrawals by Barker in Miami about a month before the break-in that totaled $89,000.
I just had to put my face in my hands for a minute.
Yeah. Pause to rub the temples a little bit.
Okay, continue.
So withdrawals matched perfectly to 4 earlier deposits Barker had made from a Mexican corporate lawyer, Manuel Degar. Hence this kind of weird Mexico connection. You see, it ended up being that a bunch of Texas donors gave these checks totaling $89,000 in the name of Manuel to Creep treasurer Hugh Sloan. The Texas donors did this in the way so that they could cover up their identity anonymously, right? And then provide the cash ahead of the April campaign finance reporting deadline, as I kind of mentioned earlier.
Shady.
Right. There was also a 5th check that Barker had deposited from a man named Kenneth Dahlberg for $25,000. Dahlberg was the Midwest Finance Chairman for the committee to re-elect the president during President Nixon's 1972 campaign. Dahlberg recalled giving this check to the Secretary of Commerce to the chair of Creep, Marie Stans, or to Creep treasurer Hugh Sloan. The $25,000 donation itself came from this guy named Dwayne Andres, who was the chief executive officer of Archer Daniels Midland, as an anonymous donation to the Nixon campaign. At the end of the day, both the Texas/Manuel checks and the Dahlberg check were given to Sloan, who gave them to Liddy, who gave them to Barker. A whole lot of money laundering. Notably, Sloan quietly resigned in July once he finally got an idea of the muck that he was in.
It's shocking that they would even bring this many people in.
Right?
The more people, the more leaks. They're plumbers.
Mm-hmm.
They should know that.
Yeah. Quote around plumbers. Quote around plumbers. Big quotes. I'd also like to note that blowing the lid off the Dahlberg check situation was actually thanks to reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodard of the Washington Post. This work led to the General Accounting Office to conduct an audit of the Nixon campaign. Another headache for the Nixon team. The money trail once again made it impossible to frame the break-ins as something completely separate from Creep. And if Hunt and Liddy flipped, it wouldn't just be the Creep folks in hot water. It would also be the White House.
Okay, that makes sense. And also, it's the committee to re-elect the president. You have to assume the president has some knowledge of what they're doing.
Totally.
Like,
Agreed.
I understand that maybe they won't be able to directly tie it to the White House, but in the court of public opinion, I mean, come on.
Agreed. In July, FBI Acting Director Gray and CIA Deputy Vernon Walters had finally had enough with the pressure from the White House aides to narrow the scope of the FBI's investigation. They were convinced it was some mid-level staff trying to conduct the cover-up, never thinking that Nixon himself was in on it. Gray even tried to tell Nixon over the phone to say that he was concerned that some White House staffers were attempting to interfere with the investigation, to which Nixon said, "Pat, you just continue to conduct your aggressive and thorough investigation." Only later did Gray find it odd that Nixon did not ask for any evidence about who or how his staff was involved.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah. Also by July, a few campaign staffers ended up going around Creep leadership and contacting the FBI themselves to give an account of what they knew. One of these staffers was none other than Al Baldwin, the man recruited by James McCord to monitor the bugs planted at the DNC and then also play watch from across the street at the motel the night of the break-in. Baldwin and the other staffers' interviews made it even more clear that at least Liddy and Hunt were deeply involved in the break-in. While the FBI wanted to widen their scope of the investigation to higher-level creep personnel and even the administration itself, the Justice Department settled on a very narrow scope that focused solely on the break-in and the wiretapping at Watergate. That summer, prosecutors moved forward with their grand jury. And despite the sheer number of subpoenas that the grand jury served, prosecutors seemed very careful not to push too far beyond Liddy and Hunt in their questioning. For example, in mid-August, Magruder was called to testify. He successfully sold the story that the dollar amount that the campaign gave to Liddy, totaling $250,000, was actually pretty small in comparison to the rest of the creep budget, and that Mitchell had been less strict on money while he had been dealing with the ITT scandal that you may remember from last episode. Go listen if you haven't, I can't get into it. After Magruder's testimony, Dean wildly called up the Justice Department's criminal division head, Henry Peterson, and later told Magruder that the investigation was no longer interested in going after a campaign official. And later that month, Nixon was officially nominated as the Republican nominee the same day that the GAO released their report on the Nixon campaign audit that found that Nixon's re-election campaign had failed to keep the required records and referred the matter to DOJ for possible prosecution. This was all in August. Despite the GAO report and the grand jury, the American populace seemed largely unfazed by the whole scandal, and seemed pretty receptive to what Nixon and the White House were saying about their lack of involvement. In late August, Nixon even said in a press conference that John Dean had done a very thorough investigation and that, quote-unquote, "we are doing everything we can to take this incident and to investigate it and to not cover it up."
That's quite the lie, but also I kind of understand why the public would kind of want to dismiss this a little bit because it's so convoluted and it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And I think that, especially at this point in American history, when it doesn't make sense, they were probably just like, let's defer to the president.
Yeah, 1,000%. Finally, on September 15th, 1972, the grand jury indicted the 5 office burglars, as well as Hunt and Liddy, for conspiracy, burglary, and violation of federal wiretapping laws. However, there was no mention anywhere of the troubling money trail and campaign funds that had ended up in Barker's bank account.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. To Nixon, Dean, and the rest of the White House team, it appeared that their cover-up had worked. The crime was seemingly confined to the burglars, plus Liddy and Hunt. In September and October as well, Representative Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, also attempted a probe into the Nixon campaign funds ahead of the election, but ultimately failed. See, Dean had concocted this plan to lobby members of Congress against the probe, saying that the 7 indicted would never receive a fair trial if Congress commenced their hearings. Another cover-up job. And by the way, Nixon wholeheartedly agreed with this plan.
Of course he did.
Even with the Nixon camp feeling pretty satisfied with their cover-up attempts thus far, I wanted to note that the press was very busy investigating further and shedding light on the campaign's strong connection to the break-in and other campaign money mishandling. It also helped that Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodard had a key informant from the FBI nicknamed Deep Throat. You may have heard of this guy before. It wasn't revealed until May 2005, but Deep Throat was actually a man named Mark Felt, who essentially served as number 2 to FBI acting director Pat Gray.
I'm not mature enough to be able to say Deep Throat with a straight face. I'm very impressed. But that's interesting. Why is that?
So there are multiple theories about why Felt did this at the end of the day. Some believe that he leaked the information for moral or patriotic reasons, or even to protect his beloved FBI. However, many believe, including me, I think, that Felt's leaks were really meant to undercut Pat Gray, who Nixon chose to lead the FBI over Felt when J. Edgar Hoover died.
Ooh, tea.
Mm-hmm. Now, Nixon, A.G. Kleindienst, and Nixon's inner circle had already suspected that Mark Felt was the FBI link, but there wasn't much they could do without making the situation worse, they reckoned. I also talked about this a little last episode, but this entire summer and up into the fall, Nixon again is still leading in the polls. A Gallup poll done that October also found that amazingly, 48% of Americans did not even recognize the word Watergate.
Crazy.
Mm-hmm. And November 7th, 1972, Nixon was reelected in one of the largest landslide election victories in American history. He defeated his opponent, South Dakota Senator George McGovern, with over 60% of the popular vote, losing only in Massachusetts and D.C.
That's because half of D.C. was in jail for his crimes.
Yeah, so true. They can't vote.
So this was all for nothing.
Yep, all for nothing. And with this victory, Nixon and his staff moved to shake up the White House employee roster. For example, Magruder was given a job at the Commerce Department. Hadelman's aide and creep liaison, Cordon Strahan, was then moved to the U.S. Information Agency, and Colson left for the private sector. This cleaning house was not only meant to cleanse the White House of any loose ends, but Nixon also thought that getting a largely new staff would also bring new energy to accomplish more than they ever had before. However, Nixon would resign from office not even 2 years into his second term.
Whoa, spoiler alert!
Sorry, guys, I figured that you guys would know by this point.
This is news to me.
But after the election, Hunt and the rest of those indicted for the burglaries were getting frustrated with the lack of consistent hush money. You see, Tony/Mr. Rivers had backed out on delivering the money in September, and the job had been passed along to White House aide Fred LaRue. The money always seemed to be late and less than promised. However, when Hunt pitched the idea about putting some more pressure on the White House for more payments to Liddy and both of their lawyers, Liddy exclaimed, "I just want everyone in this room to understand one thing. I am not for sale."
Dedication, I guess?
Once again, committed to the bet. But Hunt was getting increasingly concerned about his position. In prepping for the burglar's trial, Hunt also realized that some of the evidence that he had kept in his safe had seemingly disappeared. Namely, the notebooks that Dean had placed in his own safe that summer. Hunt was kind of banking on those notebooks to show that his actions were directed from the White House itself. And to add insult to injury, his wife Dorothy died in a plane crash on the way to Chicago on December 8th, 1972. This plunged Hunt into a deep, dark depression, and he began pondering the idea of pleading guilty.
Oof, when it rains, it pours.
Yeah. There's a lot more detail about this plane crash that I think is really interesting. And again, it's timing-wise, it's kind of crazy. I'm not going to get into it, but really sad for Hunt that she died. And they also had children as well, too. Yeah. On January 10th, 1973, the burglary and wiretapping trial finally Hey everyone, I can't talk today. Let's start that over. On January 10th, 1973, the burglary and wiretapping trial finally began, with Judge John Circa presiding. From the opening statements, it was clear that the prosecutors did not intend to provide a clear motive for the break-in. Very frustrating. Instead, they painted Liddy as a rogue operator, and that Hunt and the Cuban operatives were only in it for the money that Liddy offered. Again, the scope was crazy narrow and pretty off base. By the afternoon, Hunt's lawyers announced that he would be pleading guilty, and in the next few days, the Cuban operatives also changed course and announced that they would plead guilty.
Question, what is Hunt's relationship with the White House at this point?
So he had only been contracted, I believe, by Creep. So he's not,
okay.
Yeah, he's gone. He's not he's not employed anymore. Yeah, at least that's what my understanding is. So the Cuban operatives changing course and announcing that they would plead guilty was also a little suspicious, since one of the Cuban operatives, Frank Sturgis, had confirmed with the New York Times over the weekend that he and the others had been receiving anonymous payments since their arrest, and those payments had significantly decreased.
What?
Yeah, pretty curious. When the Cubans pled guilty in front of Judge Sirica, I think I butchered that before, so apologies, guys. When the Cubans pled guilty in front of Judge Sirica, the judge tried to probe further about the payments they received, but the Cubans would not give anything up. With that, only two defendants of the burglary remained, Liddy and McCord. McCord had not been pleased with the investigation. He felt like he had been hung out to dry, and he also didn't like how the White House had tried to frame the break-in as a CIA operation. As a former CIA operation, he just felt like this was plain wrong. McCord had also approached Bernard Barker to see if he would work with the prosecutors alongside him. Barker decided not to do this, but word of this traveled back to Dean. Dean scrambled to get the message to McCord that, quote-unquote, "A year isn't a long time. Your wife and family will be taken care of. You will be rehabilitated with employment when this is all over." However, it was back-channeled to Dean that McCord was far more interested in his freedom over Dean's promise. Remember this. But McCord wasn't the only one that Dean reached out to. In the days before the trial started, Dean also reached out to Liddy and told him that the White House needed his silence. In it for Liddy was $30,000 per year, paid legal fees, a cushy federal prison to serve time in, and a pardon within 2 years. Yes, a pardon.
Wow.
Side note, I have a very funny story about my friend who received a pardon, if we would like a brief palate cleanser.
Yes.
My friend was pardoned by President Biden because I think it was simple possession of marijuana. Because he and his fiance now had gone into a national park, which is federal land, and I guess they had a blunt on them. I don't remember the full story. Anyways, they were caught, and they got charged, but President Biden officially pardoned them in December.
Yeah, he did like a bunch of low-level possession convictions.
Yeah, so they have this great PDF where it says you've been pardoned. Anyways, and this, maybe this also says where I'm from too. Anyway, so my friend got this pardon. He goes, the first thing I did is I had to go exercise my Second Amendment right. And he went out and bought a gun.
What?
Because with the conviction before he couldn't. But he got pardoned. He was like, we have to go buy a gun immediately.
I see the logic. I'm not totally following it, but go off.
Shout out to my friend. If you listen to this, just know I love you deeply and wholeheartedly.
And shout out to President Biden for, pardoning a bunch of low-level possession convictions.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's bull. No one should be in jail for simple possession.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agree. Anyways.
Back to Watergate.
Yeah. The rest of the trial was relatively unremarkable, despite having 60 witnesses to testify. But by the end of January, the jury found Liddy and McCord guilty on all counts. Their sentencing was set for March 23rd. Frustrated with the remaining unanswered questions from the trial, Judge Sirica actually implored the Senate to get to the bottom of what happened. Notably, after the trial ended, John Dean destroyed the Hunt notebooks that he had kept from the FBI and prosecutors. Dean, of course, would later testify that he had only leafed through them and could not recall what was in them. A curious statement from someone who had hid the notebooks for months and then later destroyed them. But our story, of course, does not end here at the conviction of Hunt and Liddy and the rest of the gang. In February 1973, the United States Senate voted 77-0 to establish a select committee to investigate Watergate, with North Carolina Senator Sam Ervin named chairman the next day. At first, the committee staff thought the investigation would ultimately lead to legislation to prohibit unfair campaign practices, but most had no idea they would actually end up implicating the president and his inner circle.
I wonder if members of Nixon's party had known that that's where it was going to end up, if they would have voted for the select committee.
Right?
I would hope so. But today they wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. No.
And so I wonder if they would have back then.
It would totally be on party lines. I think actually overall, it seems like there's a pretty good bipartisan consensus, which I think is really lovely and great. Mm-hmm. And let's bring that back. So the Senate probe was especially concerning for the Nixon camp since they had no control over it, which they kind of had with the FBI and the Justice Department. The Senate probe also had a much broader jurisdiction. So Hadelman, Ehrlichman, and Dean once again decided they needed to continue their cover-up activities and block the investigation by framing it as a partisan scam using the idea of executive privilege to prevent the White House from participating. Executive privilege is going to come up a lot in the rest of the case, but I'm going to flesh that out in a later date. Nixon and his inner circle also came up with this idea that Dean would publish a report that outlined his investigation and showed that the White House had no part in the scandal. The only problem is, Dean had not conducted an investigation and had instead conducted a cover-up.
Finer details, Sarah. Stop splitting hairs.
As far as continued hush money was concerned, Dean and the company decided that John Mitchell, now in the private sector, needed to be the one who raised the money for the 7 convicted burglars. Nixon had become very concerned with the idea that one of the 7 would flip, even saying, "We gotta cut our losses. My losses are to be cut. The president's losses got to be cut on the cover-up deal."
Mm-hmm. Third person.
Right, and I like how he goes from our losses, my losses, the president's losses, right?
This is about the office, not me.
Yeah. Mitchell and the Nixon team arranged to get the funds from Hunt and others through Republican fundraiser Greek grocery tycoon Thomas Papas. Papa's only request was that Nixon keep in place the current Greek ambassador. It was an easy yes from Nixon.
Okay, honestly, of all the quid pro quos and the shady behavior we've seen, this one is feels inconsequential.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, we've already gone this far. Hell yeah. Easy yes.
And you know what? You want your Greek ambassador? Go off.
So Papas ended up coming through with a lower sum of money than requested, and it seems like this was the end of the payments to the convicted 7. But they did get one last final kind of package, I guess, of funds. The same month that the Senate commissioned their committee, in February 1973, Nixon also made a huge error in officially nominating Pat Gray as the permanent director of the FBI. To Nixon, Gray was seen as loyal, especially with him keeping silent about the files in Hunt's safe that Dean had passed along to him. But we know that Gray was kind of a softie and very green to the job when the burglary happened. So in preparing for his confirmation hearing, Gray let it slip to his FBI team that he'd been passing along the raw interview reports to John Dean himself. The FBI agents present were horrified.
And what are the interview reports? Are these from the investigation?
Yes, the raw interview reports essentially are when the FBI went to interview White House staff and, this, that, and the other, they had the raw interview reports. And then I think they would also put perhaps maybe commentary at the end of it too.
Got it.
Anyways, but Dean had convinced Gray to pass those along to him, like from like the very beginning. So Dean always knew what was going on in the investigation.
And there was no anonymity for the White House staff. If it was the raw interview reports, I would imagine their names were on there, so he knew who was saying what.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah, so Gray also admitted during the Senate hearing to passing along those files to Dean, which perked the Senate's interest into Dean's involvement with the whole Watergate affair. In addition, Gray also admitted during that hearing that Dean had probably lied to FBI agents about the contents of Hunt's safe.
Probably? Yeah. That's just funny. He's like, oh, yeah, probably lied.
He probably lied. Yeah, so this is a really bad situation. Not only does now everyone and their mother know that Gray is kind of an awful FBI acting director because he's passing along these reports to the White House counsel, but also now Dean, who kind of wasn't as big of a figure, and he definitely wasn't in the inner circle before the Watergate break-in, and now he's kind of like, he's gotten himself in the inner circle through his cover-up activities. But again, now the Senate's going like, wait, John Dean, who? Let's look into this guy.
Yeah.
So this is where things start to unravel once again, especially for Dean. By March, the pressure was starting to take a toll on Dean. Nixon still wanted this quote-unquote Dean report, absolving the White House of any guilt, and Dean quite frankly did not know where to start. In a 1 hour and 43-minute meeting with Nixon, Dean had this kind of come to Jesus moment type conversation with Nixon in which he laid out everything he knew from Hunt and Liddy's early gemstone proposal to John Mitchell, Dean's access to the FBI and the Justice Department, all the way up to the latest issue of raising more untraceable hush money. Please note that this entire exchange is also recorded, so we know exactly how it all went down. Surprisingly, Nixon asked Dean to put a number on the amount of hush money that they still needed. Dean estimated that they would need about $1 million over the next 2 years. Nixon, again surprisingly, said, "We could get that. I know where it could be gotten."
What?
Mm-hmm. Dean also admitted that they were working with Papa's to get the hush money for Hunt and his legal fees and such. And Nixon said, "I know." Which Dean was shocked to hear because he thought only himself, Mitchell, Ehrlichman, and LaRue knew about this.
Which is already, in my opinion, too many people.
However, even more shocking was that Nixon also admitted to seeing one of the photos that Hunt and Liddy had took in LA during the Ellsberg mission.
What?
Yeah. Clearly, Nixon knew more than Dean had ever imagined. All right, now we're to March 23rd, 1973, the sentencing of the original Watergate defendants. Things immediately took an unexpected turn when Judge Sirica, I always want to say Sirica for some reason. When Judge Sriracha, the judge, announced that he had received a letter from James McCord that he was going to unseal and read aloud to the courtroom. McCord's letter contained 6 shocking revelations. Number 1. There was political pressure applied to the defendants to plead guilty and remain silent. Number 2. Perjury occurred during the trial in matters highly material to the very structure, orientation, and impact of the government's case, and to the motivation and intent of the defendants. Number 3. Others involved in the Watergate operation were not identified during the trial, and they could not have been by those testifying. Number 4. The Watergate operation was not a CIA operation. The Cubans may have been misled by others into believing it was a CIA operation. I know for a fact that it was not. Number 5. Some statements were unfortunately made by a witness which left the court with the impression that he was stating untruths or withholding facts of his knowledge, when in fact only honest errors of memory were involved. Okay, whatever. Number 6. My motivations were different than those of others involved, but they were not limited to, or simply those offered in my defense during the trial. This is no fault of my attorneys, but of the circumstances under which we had to prepare my defense.
Perjury occurred.
Yeah.
Insane.
That's the big thing. The judge tabled McCord's sentence, but went ahead and sentenced the other 6. Liddy was sentenced to 6 years and 8 months in prison. Hunt was sentenced to 2.5 to 8 years in prison. Barker was sentenced to 18 months to 6 years in prison. Gonzalez, Sturgis, and Martinez were all sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison.
I feel really bad for Barker, Gonzalez, Sturgis, and Martinez. They really had no idea what they were getting into with all of this.
No, they had no idea. They were not properly informed. Hunt really kept... I don't even think Hunt knew the full extent to things, but these guys, the Cubans, they definitely didn't. And it really
No.
sucks that they,
Ask follow-up questions. You know what? Maybe if they had just gotten to do their whole fire truck thing, they never would have gotten caught.
It's so true.
Maybe it was, they needed their decommissioned fire truck.
John Mitchell just needed to put a little bit more money on the table from the get-go. And
Yeah. He kept these men handcuffed. He did not let them fully dive into this espionage mission.
Right. And maybe if he had, we wouldn't be here. Going back to the Cubans for 1 second. Hunt did feel bad, I want to say. He, truly did feel bad because Hunt couldn't fathom, first of all, they were going to get caught. But even if they did get caught, remember Hunt's this has been commissioned by former AG John Mitchell and the White House, and this is going to get, brushed under the rug. It's going to be no big deal. Immunity, at least a pardon, right? Those things, I think, were going through his head.
I think that they just had too many people who had gotten away with too much, or who had too many reasons to assume that they were safe.
Yeah.
And they needed someone not like that.
Yeah. You heard it here, folks, guys. We should write a book. So in the wake of this letter that McCord writes to the judge, McCord also requested a meeting with the Senate Watergate Committee, where he told investigators that major players such as Magruder had perjured himself on the stand during the burglars' trial. McCord ended up testifying for the committee, but most damaging information that implicated Mitchell, Magruder, and Dean was all deemed hearsay from Liddy. Despite this, McCord's testimony helped the committee keep turning over stones in the investigation. For example, they talked to a creep secretary who had a copy of Magruder's calendar, which documented a meeting between Liddy, the AG, and Dean in January and February of 1972. Some staffers also recalled seeing Liddy fumbling around with a big package that most guessed were a chart. A callback to Liddy and Hunt's meeting on Operation Gemstone, where they had those huge, obnoxious charts with pretty colors and stuff.
I'm choosing to picture it as one of those trifold boards you get for science class.
I think it might have been very close to that. McCord also requested to the judge a chance to testify to the grand jury for immunity. McCord ended up testifying and was exited immunity from further prosecution from the case.
I guess I'm glad he stepped up.
Yeah.
At least someone did.
I mean, the case is making progress for sure. Dean, of course, though, he's not having a great time. Within 2 days, in March 1973, the FBI director, Pat Gray, told senators that Dean probably lied to the FBI, and then McCord broke the burglar's wall of silence with his letter. In addition, the Nixon Inner Circle had decided to switch the script internally and hang the whole thing on Magruder and Mitchell. Starting to assess his own vulnerabilities, Dean laid out the situation to his lawyer, who essentially said, holy shit, dude, you're guilty as hell of conspiracy to obstruct justice.
I don't know if he's a great lawyer or a horrible lawyer.
That was a real quote, by the way, for sure, from the lawyer. So Dean's lawyer went to the lead prosecutors of the Watergate break-in, and they hashed out a plan for Dean to speak to the prosecutors off the record. Just before walking into the prosecutor's office, Dean called up Hadelman on April 3rd to let him know where he was and what he was about to do. Hadelman was shocked. Dean laid out most of the full scope of the cover-up, really only leaving out Nixon's direct involvement. The prosecutors found Dean credible and were thrilled to have another break in the case. And just after Dean started switching his loyalties, so did Magruder. Although Magruder did not know that Dean had already begun to cooperate. Instead, Magruder had seen the writing on the wall on his own behalf and decided it was time to come clean to prosecutors. He pointed the fingers at Dean, but mostly John Mitchell. Magruder's lawyers and the prosecution struck a deal for this information, of course. Magruder would only get one single felony count indictment for his earlier perjury, a charge that would only likely result in a 20-month prison stint. Having got word about Magruder's testimony that put John Mitchell at the center of the scandal, A.G. Kleindienst recused himself from, again, guys, Kleindienst, I think, is how...
You can just call him AGK.
Thank you. So AGK recused himself from the investigation because of his close relationship with the former AG, John Mitchell. This put the Justice Department's criminal division head, Henry Peterson, in charge of overseeing the case. By mid-April, Dean also revealed to prosecutors about the earlier missions to break into the Ellsberg psychiatrist's office. For the first time, prosecutors were understanding why the White House had gone to such lengths to cover up the break-in. The break-in at the Watergate complex, again, wasn't this rogue-off mission by Hunt and Liddy. It was part of a larger White House strategy.
Strategy is generous, but yeah.
The prosecutors immediately tipped off Peterson to the new findings from Dean, and it wasn't long before Dean received a call from the president himself. The next day, Dean walked into Nixon's private office at the EOB, Executive Office Building. Dean emphasized that Hadelman and Ehrlichman were just as vulnerable as he was legally, and Nixon asked if Dean was prepared to resign. Dean confirmed yes.
I wonder if they met in the EOB because it wasn't being tapped. Because wasn't it just the Oval Office that he had tapped?
No, but I don't... That's a good question.
Just interesting. Maybe they're finally learning.
Yeah. Hey, let's not have all these conversations.
Yeah.
But in a seemingly last-ditch effort to clear himself, Nixon also tried confirming... Oh, actually, scratch that. Because, yes, there was a recording system here in the private office. There was, because in a seemingly last-ditch effort to clear himself, Nixon also tried confirming with Dean in the conversation that Nixon himself had no idea of the full scope of things until his earlier one-on-one come-to-Jesus moment with Dean, which we all know is to be untrue.
Massively untrue.
On April 16th, Nixon announced cooperation with the Senate committee and cautioned that if any members of his administration were indicted, that person would be suspended immediately and would hopefully not receive any immunity. He ended by saying, I condemn any attempts to cover up this case, no matter who is involved.
Bold statement knowing you're involved.
And this kind of immunity statement was totally seen as a direct shot at Dean, who they figured rightly would want some kind of immunity deal for copying up to the extensive cover-up. By the end of April, there was a sea of resignations. Magruder resigned from his job at the Commerce Department. AGK resigned from being the Attorney General, and FBI Acting Director Gray resigned from his post after the media leaked that he had also destroyed the documents given to him by Dean and Ehrlichman, the other files that Dean had passed along. But most shocking of all, Nixon finally asked for his two right-hand men, Hadelman and Ehrlichman, to resign in 2 separate meetings.
The Nixon team is just hemorrhaging.
On April 29th, 1973, Nixon summoned Hadelman and Ehrlichman to Camp David, where it would be later revealed he used the same sorry narrative to ask for their resignations. This is 2 separate meetings. This sorry sob story thing is, quote-unquote, last night before I went to bed, I knelt down and this time prayed that I wouldn't wake up in the morning. I just couldn't face going on.
So dramatic, and to use the story twice.
Right. Nixon also tried to make things better by offering them financial support in the range of $200,000 to $300,000, but both declined. Ehrlichman apparently replied this. Just explain this all to my kids, will you? Tell them why you had to do this.
Devastating.
It was also that day that the AG resigned, and Dean received a call that he had been fired, because up to that point, he still had not resigned for some reason. But with that, pretty much all the inner circle who had conducted the cover-up to that point, besides Nixon himself, of course, were booted out of the White House. The next day, Nixon addressed the American people announcing the departure of AG Kleindienst, Hadelman, Ehrlichman, and Dean, and a new attorney general named Elliot Richardson. Nixon also reaffirmed his commitment for truth by announcing that he had ordered a new investigation. Here are some of my favorite bits from the address. Harley, I would like you to read them.
I want to talk to you tonight from my heart on a subject of deep concern to every American. In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair. As the investigations went forward, I repeatedly asked those conducting the investigation whether there was any reason to believe that members of my administration were involved in any way. I received repeated assurances that they were not. Whatever may appear to have been the case before, whatever improper activities may yet be discovered in connection with this whole sordid affair, I want the American people, I want you to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that during my term as president, justice will be pursued fairly, fully, and impartially, no matter who is involved. This office is a sacred trust, and I am determined to be worthy of that trust. He knows he's lying.
Just blatantly lying.
What was his end game out of this?
I think he just thought that he was going to be able... I think he knew the optics looked really bad. But I still think that he was... I don't think he ever thought that he would be impeached or you would have to resign. I think he just thought the optics were going to look bad, and this is the first part of the second term. Got 4 more years to get past this. I have a whole new staff now. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, there were so many lies up to that point. I think he just figured he had to keep going.
I guess he was hoping that he could just throw staff under the bus until the story died.
Yeah. I mean, even now his AG is gone, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know, dude. It's really crazy. So this is where I'm going to end this episode. I know.
I saw it coming.
I know. Because this is really the point in which Nixon had hoped and tried to make a fresh start as far as he could with his new staff. From here, Nixon's cover-up takes a new shape without his closest aides. But even with a whole new staff, the damage is done. Part 4 is going to focus on Nixon's last attempt to save his reputation and presidency by employing executive privilege to prevent the release of notorious and incriminating Oval Office tapes.
Ooh, I know how it ends, but I'm still excited.
Yeah. Also, I'd like to note, too, for the audience, the next part, part 4, is probably going to be a little while in the making. Thank you in advance for your patience. There's a lot going on in this world, as we talked about at the top of this episode. We're actually going to do an August recess ourselves for the podcast. It probably won't be early as September until we hear what happens next. But if you really are chomping at the bit to learn more, you should read Garrett Graff's book, A Watergate, A New History.
Exactly. It's already out there. And we should post a schedule update to our Instagram.
Yes.
But we are going to take August recess, so there will not be any new Crime in Congress episodes posted during August. But we're working on some fun new content. And so we'll be back strong in September.
Yeah, got some mini episodes coming that we're very excited about to share.
And with that, Watergate Part 3 is officially wrapped.
Harley, would you like to gavel us out?